My son called me back 3 days after I left him a voicemail about the surgery. 3 days. And when he finally picked up, the first thing he said was, "Dad, the timing is really bad right now." The timing. I was 63 years old, sitting in a plastic chair at the St. Michael's Hospital Cardiology Clinic in Toronto, holding a referral letter that said I needed a mitral valve repair. The surgeon's office had already told me the provincial coverage would handle most of it, but there was a gap. Equipment fees. A private anesthesiologist my cardiologist strongly recommended, and a recovery facility my doctor said would make a real difference for someone my age. The out-of-pocket number came to $2,200, not $200,000, not even $20,000. $2,200. My son had just finished renovating his second investment property in Oakville. I didn't say any of that to him on the phone. I just told him the number. I told him what the money was for. I told him the surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks out and that I was trying to get things organized in advance so I wouldn't have to rush. He said, "Let me talk to Brittany and see what we can figure out." Brittany is his wife. She's the kind of woman who tracks every grocery receipt in a spreadsheet, but flew to Cabo for their 4th anniversary. I've met her maybe a dozen times in 7 years. She sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of their dog on it. The dog's name is Ranger. I know more about Ranger's dietary restrictions than I know about what my son does on any given Tuesday, I said. Of course. Take your time. He never called back. I should tell you a little about who I am, because I think it matters. I spent 31 years working for the City of Toronto, municipal infrastructure, specifically water and waste systems. I wasn't management. I was the guy who showed up at 5 in the morning when a main broke in February, who stood in the cold for 8 hours until the problem was fixed, who knew every foreman and every contractor and every quirk of every aging pipe in the eastern districts. I retired at 60 with a decent pension, not a lavish one. My wife, Carol, she passed 6 years ago now, breast cancer. She was a dental hygienist. We owned a semi-detached in East York that we bought in 1994 for a price that sounds like a joke today. We raised 2 kids in that house. My son, the older one, went into real estate. He's done well. Better than well, actually. The market did most of the heavy lifting, if I'm honest, but he worked hard too, and I'm not going to take that away from him. He bought a detached house in Mississauga at 31. He drives a truck that costs more than my first mortgage. He is by any external measure a successful man. My daughter is a personal support worker. She makes barely above minimum wage. She takes the bus. She lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in Scarborough with her boyfriend, who works night shifts at a warehouse in Ajax. She has no savings to speak of. She sends me text messages to check in on me twice a week, sometimes more when she knows I have appointments. I want you to understand the picture before I go any further. My heart had been giving me trouble for about 2 years before the diagnosis came through. Fatigue, some shortness of breath on stairs. I chalked it up to age, to grief. Carol's absence had done something to me I don't have the vocabulary for, even now. But my family doctor ran an ECG in the spring, referred me to a cardiologist, and by August I had a name for what was happening. Mitral valve regurgitation. Not an emergency, the cardiologist said, but not something to leave unaddressed either. The valve was leaking. We needed to fix it. The surgery itself would be covered. That's the thing people outside Canada don't always understand. The actual procedure, the hospital stay, the surgical team, all of that falls under provincial health coverage. What isn't covered is everything around the edges. The private anesthesiologist was a choice, but my cardiologist, Dr. Osi, was direct with me. At your age, with your cardiac history, I would pay for it myself if I were you. The recovery facility wasn't medically required, but going home to an empty house 48 hours post-surgery and trying to manage on my own was the alternative. $2,200. I had it in savings. I want to be clear about that. I was not destitute. I was not in crisis. But I had also just replaced my furnace the previous winter, and my car needed work, and I was being careful the way people on fixed incomes have to be careful. I thought about asking my son not because I had no other options, but because I thought. Foolishly, it turns out that family meant something in moments like this. When he didn't call back, I waited a week. Then I called again. It went to voicemail. I left a message. I said I just wanted to know if he'd had a chance to think about it. I said no pressure, I was just trying to plan ahead. 4 days later, I got a text. Not a call. A text. Dad, we've looked at this and we're just stretched really thin right now with the Oakville property and some other stuff. Hope you understand. Let us know how the surgery goes. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen table and I sat there for a long time. Let us know how the surgery goes. Like it was a camping trip. Like it was something I could send a postcard about. I didn't tell my daughter about the text right away. I didn't tell her about any of it, actually. Not the surgery. Not the financial gap. Not the conversation with her brother. I didn't want her to worry. She had enough going on. She was picking up extra shifts to help cover her boyfriend's hours when the warehouse had a slow stretch, and I knew she was behind on one of her credit cards. I've always been the kind of father who tried not to add to people's burdens. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I should have talked more, asked for more. Carol used to say I carried things alone until they crushed me, and she was probably right about that. What happened was that my daughter showed up at my door on a Thursday evening in early October with a container of soup she'd made. She does that sometimes. Just appears with food. She said she'd been worried because I seemed quieter than usual when we'd talked on the phone and she wanted to check in. We sat at the kitchen table with the soup, and she looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when she knew I was holding something back. Same eyes. Same patience in them, I told her. Not the part about her brother yet, just the surgery, the date, the gap. I laid it out plainly the way I'd learned to talk about things after 31 years dealing with bureaucrats and engineers. Just the facts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" I said, "You've got enough on your plate." She shook her head. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and she said, "That's not how this works. I'm your daughter." Then she asked how much. I told her I wasn't asking her for anything. I said I had it figured out. She said, "Dad, how much?" I told her. She nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else for a minute. Then she said she'd be right back, and she went out to her car. I thought she'd forgotten something, and she came back in with an envelope. She put it on the table in front of me. I opened it. Inside was $1,100 in cash. 20s and 50s, the way you accumulate bills when you're someone who uses cash because you're trying to stay on budget. There was a folded piece of paper tucked underneath the bills. I unfolded it. It was a receipt from her credit union, a partial withdrawal and a balance transfer. She'd moved $1,100 from her TFSA and the rest, she said, she could have to me by the end of the week from her next paycheck. The only savings she had. I said, "Absolutely not. I'm not taking this." She said, "It's already done. The transfer's already done." I said, "I'll transfer it back." She looked at me with those eyes, Carol's eyes, and she said, "Dad, you let me help you. You let me do this one thing." I didn't say anything. I couldn't, honestly. There was something happening in my chest that had nothing to do with my mitral valve. She said quietly, "Does Marcus know?" She didn't say it with any particular edge, just asked it plain. That was when I told her about the text. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. She sat very still, and she read the text when I showed it on my phone. And then she handed the phone back to me, and she picked up her spoon and she finished her soup. Later, after we'd washed the dishes together and she was getting ready to leave, she said, "I'm not going to say anything to him. That's your relationship and your decision. But I want you to know that whatever you need between now and after the surgery, and after that, I'm here. Okay? I'm just here." I nodded. She hugged me at the door. She's not a tall woman. She's always been small, like her mother. She held on a little longer than usual. After she left, I stood in the hallway of my house for a long time. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the years I'd spent working double shifts to put her brother through university. I thought about the down payment I'd contributed to his first property. $30,000. Everything Carol and I had set aside in a joint account that we'd agreed would go to helping the kids when they needed it. I thought about the fact that I'd never asked for any of it back, because that's not why we gave it. I thought about how I hadn't received a birthday call from him this past year, only a message through a group chat my daughter had set up for family updates. And I thought about my daughter and her $1,100 in 20s and 50s. There's a thing that happens when you get old enough. And I don't mean ancient, I just mean past a certain point, where you start to see people with a clarity you didn't have when you were younger and more willing to make excuses for them. You stop squinting. You see what's there. What I saw was this. My son had become a man I didn't recognize, not a villain, not some Hollywood monster. Just a man who had drifted so far into a version of life where his time and money and attention were organized entirely around his own comfort that he had lost the capacity to look sideways. He wasn't cruel. He was something almost worse than cruel. He was indifferent. And my daughter, exhausted, broke, taking the bus, picking up extra PSW shifts at a long-term care facility in Scarborough. My daughter had crossed town on a Thursday night with an envelope of cash from her TFSA. I made a decision that night. I want to say first that the surgery went well. Dr. Osi was pleased with the result. The valve is repaired, my recovery is on track, and I spent 5 days at the recovery facility my cardiologist recommended in North York before I was cleared to go home. My daughter visited twice. She brought soup both times. Different soup, she said, because variety is important for healing, and she said it with a straight face, which made me laugh for the first time in weeks. My son sent a text the day after the surgery. It said, "Hope everything went well. Let me know if you need anything." I did not reply. Not out of anger, exactly. More because I realized I had nothing to say that would be useful. The conversation I might have wanted to have, the real one, about what happened, about who showed up and who didn't, that conversation requires two people who are both paying attention. I wasn't sure my son was capable of paying attention to anything that didn't have his name on a title deed. What I did instead was this. About 3 weeks after I came home from the recovery facility, I called a lawyer. Her name is Patricia Oyalaran. She has an office in Leslieville. A woman around 50, sharp and no-nonsense, the kind of lawyer who doesn't let you waste her time or your own. I'd used her once before for a property matter and I trusted her. I made an appointment and I went in and I told her what I wanted to do. I had a will. Most people my age do. Mine was straightforward. The house split equally between my 2 children. The pension and registered accounts distributed the same way. A few small bequests to Carol's sister and a friend from the city who'd been good to us over the years. I'd written it the year after Carol died, when I was trying to get my affairs in order because grief has a way of making you practical about mortality. I told Patricia I wanted to revise it. I told her I wanted to leave my daughter the house outright. The East York semi-detached that, in the current Toronto market, was worth somewhere north of $800,000. I told her I wanted to establish a small living trust that would cover my daughter's rent if anything happened to me before she was financially stable. I told her I wanted to leave my son my father's watch, which he had always admired, and a letter. Patricia looked at me carefully and said, "Are you sure about this?" I said yes. She said, "Do you want to take a week and come back? Just to be certain?" I said, "I've been certain for 3 weeks. I just needed to physically recover first." She nodded. She didn't push further. She understood. The will was revised and signed within 10 days. I haven't told my son. I don't plan to. The house will still be there, doing what houses in East York do. Sitting quietly, appreciating, being worth more every year than the year before. My son doesn't need it. He has 2 properties already. What he needs is something I cannot give him through a will or a conversation or anything I can think of. My daughter doesn't know either. I'll tell her eventually. Probably before I have any more surgeries, because I'm 63 and realistic about the trajectory of things. But I wanted some time to live with the decision first, to make sure it was the right shape. It is. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and I think it's the most important part of all of this. About 2 months after the surgery, my daughter and I drove up to Algonquin for a long weekend. I'd been wanting to go for years. Carol and I used to go in the 90s, before the kids were school age, and I'd kept meaning to go back and never quite got around to it. My daughter had never been. She'd taken the time off work, borrowed her boyfriend's car, because she said his had more cargo space for the gear, and we loaded up on a Friday morning and drove north on the 400. We stopped in Huntsville for coffee. We hiked a trail on the Saturday that was about 8 kilometers, which was more than my cardiologist had technically cleared me for, but the pace was slow, and the trees were extraordinary. It was mid-October, and the color was at its peak, that particular Ontario autumn gold that I don't think you can describe properly if you haven't seen it. My daughter kept stopping to take photos. She'd hand me her phone and say, "Dad, look at this one," and show me the shot she'd just taken. And I'd look, and she was right. They were beautiful. On the second evening, we sat outside the cabin after dinner. It was cold enough that we had a fire going, and we were wrapped in blankets, and there was no sound except the fire and occasionally something moving in the trees. No traffic, no phones, just that stillness you only find up north. She said, after a long quiet, "How are you actually doing? Not physically. Just, how are you?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the past year, the diagnosis, the surgery, the text message, the $1,100 in an envelope, Patricia Oyalaran's office in Leslieville, the revised will. I said, "I think I'm better than I've been in a while." She said, "Yeah?" I said, "Yeah." She pulled her blanket tighter and looked at the fire and said, "Mom would have liked this trip." I said, "She would have been the one planning it. We'd have a laminated itinerary." My daughter laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes up sudden and warm. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in a while. I looked at the fire. I thought about what I had and what I didn't have, and what I'd learned to tell the difference between. There are people who show up, and there are people who don't. And you spend a lot of your life, if you're like me, trying to explain to yourself why the ones who don't show up still deserve the same weight on the scale as the ones who do. You make excuses. You give the benefit of the doubt. You tell yourself they're busy, they're stressed, the timing is just really bad right now. And then one day someone hands you an envelope of 20s and 50s from the only savings account they have, and you stop making excuses. Not out of bitterness. That's the part I want to be clear about. I don't carry this with anger. I carry it the way you carry a lesson you wish you'd learned earlier, with a kind of tired gratitude that you finally learned it at all. My daughter is the person who showed up. She showed up at my door with soup. She showed up with an envelope. She showed up with a borrowed car and an 8-kilometer trail, and a fire in the cold. I'm 63 years old, and I've had heart surgery, and my wife has been gone 6 years, and my son is a stranger who sends me texts he doesn't mean. But I have my daughter. When I really stop and let myself feel it, I think that's a kind of wealth that doesn't show up on any mortgage document. It's enough. More than enough. That's what I know now.